I want to give you a number before we start tonight. Just one. And then, honestly, I want you to let it go again, because it's a heavy thing to carry down a dark road, and you've got miles to make, but you ought to hear it once. Right now tonight, while you and I roll down this empty highway together, there are tens of thousands of people in this country lying in graves that don't have their names on them. Tens of thousands, men and women, and God help us, children, who died somewhere far from anyone who ever loved them, and were buried by strangers under a stone that says UNKNON, or DOE, or nothing at all. Every single one of them was somebody. Everyone had a mother who taught them to tie their shoes, a name that got hollered across a yard at supper time, a favorite song they'd turn up when it came on the radio. And every one of them, at the end, came down to a body with no name, in a county that didn't know them, going into the cold ground. And here's the part that ought to sit you up a little straighter behind that wheel. A great many of them were found exactly where you are right now, beside a road. The highway is good at that, taking people, carrying them a long way from home, and then keeping them. For every mile marker you pass tonight, somewhere out there in the dark history of these roads, there's a marker just like it, where somebody was found, and never claimed, and never named. But not always, and not forever, because every so often, and more, these days, somebody finally gets a name back. 40 years late, 50, but back. Tonight's first story is about one of them, a girl who was found beside a highway in the summer of 1981, with nothing on her to say who she was. About a whole town that couldn't stand to bury a girl with no name, so they gave her one of their own. And about the long road. It took 4 decades of it to finally carve the right name into her stone. So stay with me. Keep your eyes on the line. This is Midnight Mile, and we have got a long way to go before morning. One quick thing before the first mile, and then I'll leave you in peace with the road. If you're driving right now, do me a favor and don't touch a single thing but that wheel. There is nothing on this screen worth your eyes tonight. I would so much rather you got where you're going than reached for any button. We will be right here either way. But when you're stopped parked, engine off, somewhere safe, if this is the kind of company you want on the long nights, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. That's the whole of it. It's the only way these keep getting made, and the only way I get to keep riding along with the people who do the dark and lonely miles while the rest of the world's asleep. So do it later when the wheels aren't turning. And thank you, either way, for the company tonight. It means more than you'd think. Alright, let me tell you about the girl they called Della. She was found on a Tuesday morning in July of 1981 in the long grass of the right-of-way along the interstate, in a quiet, piney stretch of South Georgia called a county, if you want a name for it, though the name hardly matters. A county road crew was out cutting the shoulder grass that summer morning, the way they did, riding the big mowers slow along the fence line, and one of the men cut his engine and waved the others over, and that was how she came back into the world. In the weeds, a few hundred feet off the southbound lanes, just past the exit for a truck stop, and a couple of gas stations and not much else. She was young. The medical examiner put her between 18 and 22. And she had been there a little while, long enough that the things that might have told them who she was had not survived it. But I want to be careful with her, the way I try to be careful with all of them tonight. So I'm going to tell you what matters and leave the rest where it belongs. She had been a healthy girl. Someone had loved her once her teeth had been cared for. An old break in her arm had been set properly by a doctor, and someone had taken everything from her. I'm not going to put the details into your head out here in the dark. You don't need them, and she deserves better than to be described that way for a story. It was a homicide. It was a bad one. Leave it there. What she did not have was a name. No purse, no wallet, no identification of any kind, no jewelry with initials, no laundry tags, no bus ticket, nothing in any pocket. Whoever had done this to her had been careful, or lucky, or both. And what they left behind the county with was a young woman, plainly a traveler, plainly from somewhere else, and absolutely no way to say who she was, or where she'd come from, or who might be, at that very moment, waiting for her to call. And the sheriff's office in Calder County, Georgia, in 1981, did everything you could do in 1981. They took her fingerprints and sent them off, and got nothing back, because hers weren't in any system. They checked their own missing persons reports, and the ones from the counties around them, and none of them fit. They put out a description on the teletype to other agencies, a young white female, so tall, such and such hair, found near the interstate, and they waited. And nobody answered. Because the thing about a girl who's hitchhiking, or riding buses, or just drifting, a long way from home, in the summer of 1981. The thing the men who hunt that kind of road understood far better than the rest of us is that she can be gone for a long time before anyone even knows to start looking. And by the time her people start looking, she's 2,000 miles and one anonymous grave away from the search. So her case went cold about as fast as a case can go cold. There was nothing to work. You can't investigate a murder when you don't know the victim, because the victim is where you start, who they were, who they knew, who'd want to hurt them. With a Jane Doe, you've got the end of the story and not one page of the beginning. The detectives did what they could, and then there was nothing left to do. And the file got thinner in everyone's mind, year by year, the way they do. But here is where it stops being just another cold case and starts being the story I wanted to tell you. Because the people of Calder County could not let her go. It started, the way these things do, with one person. There was a deputy who'd been there that July morning, a man named Wade Tatum, and Wade Tatum could not get the girl out of his head. The not knowing of her, mostly. The idea that somewhere out there was a mother who'd raised this girl and had no idea she was lying in a drawer at the medical examiner's and would maybe never know. Wade had a daughter about that age. I think that was a lot of it. I want you to know a little more about Wade Tatum because he's one of the quiet heroes of this, and he never knew it. He wasn't a detective, just a county deputy, a big, slow, careful man who'd grown up in Calder County and figured he'd die there, which he did. He wasn't fancy. But that summer broke something open in him that never quite closed. His own girl, Sue, was 16 that year, and Wade told her about Della, not the bad parts, just that there was a young lady out at the county cemetery who'd been somebody's daughter and had nobody to claim her, and that the two of them were going to look in on her, now and again, so she wouldn't be entirely alone. And they did. For 30 years, Wade Tatum stopped by that grave under the oaks on his way home from a shift, on Della's birthday, which of course nobody knew, so he'd picked one, the day she was found, and he'd stand there a minute with his hat in his hands. His daughter grew up doing it with him. People in town got used to seeing the deputy's cruiser parked by the cemetery gate at odd hours, and they understood, and they left him to it. He kept the case file in his own desk, long after it should have gone to a basement somewhere, and every few years he'd pull it out and call around and try the new thing, whatever the new thing was, and get nowhere, and put it back. He retired. He got old. And he died in 2011, of an ordinary thing, an old man in his recliner, and he died after 30 years of tending her, still not knowing her name. That's the part that I can't quite make peace with, and I'll come back to it. But hold on to Wade. He matters at the end, and after some months, when it became clear that nobody was coming for her, the county faced a small, sad, bureaucratic question. What do you do with an unidentified body that no one claims? And the usual answer, the county budget answer, is not a kind one, but Wade Tatum wouldn't have it. He went around, hat in hand, and he raised money from the sheriff's office, from the churches, from the diner, from people who just heard about it and pressed a few dollars into his palm at the gas station. A whole little county, passing the hat for a girl none of them had ever met. And they bought her a real plot in the good cemetery in town, under the oaks, and a real headstone. And they had to put something on the stone. You can't carve UNK known on a girl you've taken into your town like that. It's too cold. So the women who'd organized most of the collection talked it over, and they came to Wade, and they asked him because it had been his cause from the start what they ought to call her. And Wade Tatum thought about it, and he said his grandmother's name had been Della, a good, old, gentle name. And he said it seemed to him this girl ought to have a gentle name, since the world had been so hard to her at the end. And so that's what they carved, Della. And underneath it, our daughter, known only to God, rest now. She was buried in the fall of 1981, and there were close to 100 people at the service for a girl whose name nobody actually knew, in a town she'd only ever passed through on her way to somewhere else. And that, you might think, would be the end of it. A kind gesture, a sad story. Time moves on. It didn't though. That's the thing. Della didn't fade. The women of that county kept her. Every Memorial Day, fresh flowers on Della's grave. Every Christmas, a little wreath. When the woman who'd started the flower tending got too old, a younger one took it up. And when she got old, a younger one still. There was a waitress at the truck stop diner, a woman named Ruby, who had been working the morning shift that July in '81 and had heard about it within the hour, and Ruby took Della especially to heart and tended that grave for the better part of 40 years and told the story to anybody who'd listen. It's a strange and beautiful thing, when you think about it, what that county did. Grief usually needs a person you mourn, someone you knew, someone who was yours. But Calder County mourned a stranger, together, for 40 years, and somehow made her theirs by doing it. Della became part of the place. There were people in that town who had never known her name but knew the date she was found the way you'd know a relative's birthday. Little girls left dandelions on her stone. Old women left roses from their own gardens. When somebody local passed away, more than once, the family asked that flowers be left for Della too, so she wouldn't be forgotten in the shuffle of fresh grief. The high school's history teacher used her, gently, every few years, to teach kids what a community owes to a person who can't speak for themselves. She was, in the oddest way, one of the best-loved people in that county, a girl nobody had ever met, held close by an entire town simply because she'd had no one else, and because they decided that no one else was not the same as nobody. They would be her somebody, for as long as it took. Kids in Calder County grew up knowing about Della, the girl by the highway, the one with no name, the one the town keeps. High schoolers would do reports on her. People left things at the stone flowers, yes, but also little notes, and once in a while a stuffed animal, the way you do for a child. A whole community, across 2 generations, grieving and tending and refusing to forget a girl that not one of them had ever spoken a word to. And all that time, 2,000 miles away, in a little town in northern Minnesota, there was a family doing the other half of it. Because Della had a name. Of course she did. And she had a family who never stopped wondering. Her real name was Bonnie Jean Marsh. And in the summer of 1981, Bonnie Jean Marsh was 18 years old, and she had left home. It wasn't a dramatic thing, the way her family told it later. She was 18 and restless, and she'd had the kind of fight with her mother that 18-year-olds have, about a boy, about the future, about wanting to see something of the country before she got stuck. And one morning she'd packed a bag and announced she was going to California, and she'd hugged her little sister, and she'd walked down to the highway to thumb a ride west, the way a lot of kids still did in 1981. She called home twice in the first couple weeks, from a gas station somewhere, from a diner somewhere else. She was fine, she said. She was having an adventure. She'd be home before long, or she'd send for them. She hadn't decided. She sounded happy. And then the call stopped. Her mother, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, waited, the way you wait, telling herself the girl was just busy, just young, just out of reach for a while. And then waiting turned to worrying, and worrying turned to the police. And Eleanor Marsh reported her daughter missing in the late summer of 1981. But here is the cruelty of it. The same cruelty that protected the man who'd done it. An 18-year-old who'd announced she was leaving home, who'd hitchhiked off toward California of her own free will that's not, to a busy police department in 1981, a kidnapping. That's a young woman who left. They took the report. They were kind. And there was, in practical terms, almost nothing they could do. A girl with no fixed location, somewhere on the vast road system of an entire country, who'd chosen to go. The report went into a file in Minnesota, and the body went into the ground in Georgia, and the 2,000 miles between them might as well have been 2,000 years. Because nothing in 1981 was ever going to connect a missing persons report in one corner of the country to a Jane Doe in another. They were 2 sealed rooms with no door between them. Eleanor Marsh spent the rest of her life not knowing. She kept Bonnie Jean's room for years. She kept the phone number the same for a decade, in case her daughter ever called. She chased every rumor, every sighting that turned out to be nothing. And she died in 2009, 28 years later, still not knowing whether her daughter was alive somewhere, having lived a whole life without her, or dead somewhere with no grave to visit. That's the thing people don't understand about a missing child. The grief never gets to land. There's no funeral. There's just a door left open forever, in a house where everyone is exhausted. Eleanor Marsh went to her own grave with that door still open. But her younger daughter, Bonnie Jean's little sister, who had been 12 years old the summer, Bonnie hugged her goodbye and walked down to the highway. She did not stop. Her name was June. And June Marsh grew up and grew old, with a sister-shaped hole in her, and a promise she'd made to her dying mother that she would keep looking. And June was the one who, decades on, finally walked Bonnie Jean's name into the modern world. She put it into the national databases that didn't exist in 1981, the ones for the missing and the unidentified. She gave her own DNA, so that if her sister's body was ever found anywhere in the country, there'd be a thread to match it to. She did the patient, unglamorous, decades-long work of a person who refuses to let the world finish forgetting. And the world, this time, was finally built to listen. Because around 2020, a cold case detective in Georgia, a younger one, a woman named Cass Renner, who'd inherited a stack of the county's oldest unsolved files, pulled Della, and Cass Renner had a tool that Wade Tatum, God rest him, never had. He died in 2011. By the way, Wade, never knowing the girl's name, having tended her memory for 30 years. But what Cass Renner had was forensic genetic genealogy, the thing you've maybe heard about on the news. They were able to recover a usable DNA profile from what had been preserved of Della all those years, and they sent it off to be worked the modern way, uploaded into the genealogy databases, the same family tree services where ordinary people go looking for their great-grandparents, where investigators, now, with permission and care, can take an unknown person's DNA and find their cousins, and their cousins' cousins, and build the tree backward and inward until it points at one empty branch. One person who should be on the tree and isn't. One name that's been missing for 40 years. I make it sound quick. It isn't. I want you to understand that, because it matters to what this is. Cass Renner spent the better part of 2 years on Della fighting to get a usable profile out of decades-old samples, finding the money for the testing, then sitting up nights with a genealogist building a family tree out of distant DNA matches, third and fourth cousins who'd spit in a tube to find out where their great-grandparents came from, and had no idea their results would one day help give a name back to a girl in a Georgia grave. You build it backward. You take the unknown person's matches, and you climb their family trees, all of them, looking for the place where two branches cross a couple, generations back, whose descendants could include your Jane Doe. And then you climb forward again, narrowing, ruling people out, until you're left looking at one family, and then one set of parents, and then one daughter who left home and never came back. It is patient, maddening, beautiful work, and it is, more than anything, an act of refusing to quit. Cass Renner had a stack of other cases on her desk. She kept coming back to the girl by the highway, because somebody before her, a deputy named Wade Tatum, whose old case file she was working from, had refused to quit for 30 years, and she could feel him in the paperwork. She told me once she felt like she was finishing something for a man she'd never met. It took months of that painstaking tree building, but it pointed, in the end, at a family in northern Minnesota, and at a daughter who'd left home in 1981 and never come back, and at a younger sister named June, whose DNA was already waiting in the system, put there years before, for exactly this. When the match came back, Cass Renner drove out to make the call in person where she could, and arranged it carefully where she couldn't, the way you do with something this big. And June Marsh, 50-some years old now, who had promised her dying mother she'd keep looking, got the phone call that her sister had been found. That Bonnie Jean had been found in 1981, only weeks after she vanished, just off a highway in Georgia. That she had not lived a long secret life somewhere without them. That she had been gone, almost the whole time, lying in the ground 2,000 miles away. And June told this part later, and it's the part that undoes me, that she had not been alone, that a whole town down in Georgia had taken her in, and named her, and buried her under the oaks, and put flowers on her grave every spring for 40 years. That the sister Eleanor Marsh feared had died unmourned and unburied in a ditch had, in fact, been mourned by 100 strangers and tended like a daughter for 4 decades. June said that was the thing that finally let her cry. Not the worst of it, the kindness of it. The idea that all those years her family was grieving an empty room in Minnesota, a town full of people they'd never met, was grieving the very same girl, and keeping her, and loving her by the only name they had. And the two families, the blood family and the town that had adopted her, they came together. June Marsh and her own children drove down to Georgia, to Calder County, and they met Ruby, the waitress, who was very old by then, but who'd kept the flowers going right up to the end. And they stood together at the grave under the oaks. And they decided, together, what to do about the stone. They could have moved her. June could have taken her sister home to Minnesota, finally, after 40 years. And she thought about it, but she said, and the town, I think, was quietly grateful. She said that Bonnie Jean had been loved in this place for 40 years, by people who'd asked for nothing, and that there was something right about her staying among them. So she stayed, but they gave her back her name. They kept the old stone they couldn't bear to take away, the one that said, "Our daughter," known only to God, the one a town had wept over in 1981. They left it right where it was, but beside it they set a new one. And on the new one it says, Bonnie Jean Marsh, and her real dates, the ones her mother would have known, 1963 to 1981. And underneath this, known now, known always, beloved of two families, 1,000 miles apart. And here's the last thing, the thing I saved, because I told you at the start that sometimes a name comes back, and sometimes a name brings the rest with it. When they had Bonnie Jean's name, they finally had the beginning of the story, instead of just the end of it. They could trace where she'd been, who'd seen her last, the truck stops, the rides, and the same genetic work that gave her a name had also, all along, been quietly turning up something else, because there had been someone else's DNA, in that case, kept all those years, waiting. And once the genealogists had a foothold, that profile got worked too. And it led them the modern way, branch by branch, to a man. An ordinary man. A man named Royce Pruitt, who in 1981 had been a young long-haul driver, drifting that interstate, and who in the decades since had lived an entirely unremarkable life, 2 states over. A neighbor, a churchgoer, by some accounts, somebody's grandfather, 71 years old when they came for him. They arrested Royce Pruitt for the murder of Bonnie Jean Marsh, 40 years after he left her in the weeds beside a Georgia highway, certain as a man can be, that she had no name and no people, and no one would ever come. He'd been right about that for 40 years. He'd been right almost long enough. He was wrong because a deputy couldn't stand to bury a girl without a name. He was wrong because a waitress kept flowers on a stranger's grave for 40 years. He was wrong because a 12-year-old's little sister grew up and made a promise to a dying mother and put a name and a swab into a system and waited. He was wrong because the world, slowly, finally built a door between the room with the missing and the room with the unnamed. So when you pass those mile markers tonight, every one of them, in the dark, I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because I think it's the truest thing I know. The road takes people. It always has. But the road does not get to keep them forever anymore. Not if somebody refuses to forget, and somebody almost always does. That was the girl they called Della. Stay with me. The next one is about a man whose whole job, for 30 years, was to watch the trucks go by in the dark, and about a notebook he kept that everybody, including him, thought was just the harmless obsession of a lonely old night shift man. It wasn't. It was the most important thing anybody on that highway ever wrote down. They just didn't find out until he was gone. Let me tell you about the way station. There's a kind of place on the interstate that you've passed 1,000 times and never once thought about, unless you drive a big rig, in which case you think about it more than you'd like. The way station, the scales. Those long aprons off the right side of the highway, lit up blue-white in the dead of night, where the trucks pull off to get weighed and checked, where a tired driver hands over his logbook and his paperwork to a state inspector and either rolls on through or gets pulled around back for a closer look. Most folks blow right past them at 70 miles an hour and never give them a second of thought. But somebody's in there, all night, every night, watching. For 30 years, on the night shift at one such station, on a major interstate that ran the length of the state, a real artery, thousands of trucks a night, the man watching was named Hollis Bream. Hollis was a state transportation inspector, and he was, by every account, the most boring and most thorough man you could ever hope to meet. He'd been an accountant before he came to the highway department, and he never stopped being one in his soul. He loved a number that added up. He loved a logbook that was filled out right. He worked the overnight shift, the 11 to 7, for almost his entire career. Because the overnight suited him fewer trucks, more time to do it properly, and the quiet of a thing done carefully in the small hours. He had a wife named Marion who learned to sleep without him, and he'd come home at dawn and have his breakfast and tell her, in his flat, contented way, about the trucks. Marion used to say she knew more about federal hours of service regulations than any woman in the state, and not one bit of it by choice. They were a good match, those two, 40-some years. No children, it hadn't worked out that way, and they'd made their peace with it and become, instead, the kind of couple that's a closed and contented circle of two. Marion kept the books for a feed store in town. Hollis kept the books, in his way, on the whole interstate. They were both people who believed that the world made more sense when somebody bothered to write it down accurately, and they loved each other in the language of small, reliable things. His breakfast ready when he came in off the night shift, the crossword they did together before he slept, the way he always called the station phone to say he'd gotten there safe, even though it was only 15 minutes down the road. Marion could read his moods, the way he read a logbook, and she could tell, the year the truck got into him, that something had changed. He'd come home quieter. He'd stand at the kitchen window a little too long. And when she finally got it out of him, there's a driver, there's a truck, something's wrong, and I can't prove it. She did what a good wife does, which was to believe him, and also to worry about him. She told him, more than once, that he couldn't take every soul on that highway home in his chest, that a man only has so much room in there, and it would hollow him out. And Hollis would nod, and agree, and reach for his notebook anyway. She let him. You let the person you love carry the thing they have to carry. She just made sure he wasn't carrying it alone. Now, a man who watches the trucks go by, all night, for 30 years, gets to where he sees patterns the way you and I see street signs. He couldn't have explained how he knew things, he just knew them. He knew the regular haulers, the company trucks that came through on schedule. He knew the difference between a driver who was just tired and a driver who was hiding something. He could read a logbook the way a doctor reads an x-ray, and he caught people, all the time, in the small lies of the trade, the cooked hours, the off-the-books runs, the bills of lading that didn't match the load. It was unglamorous work, but Hollis was good at it, the way some men are quietly, deeply good at a thing the world doesn't bother to notice. And somewhere in the early 1990s, Hollis Bream started noticing a truck. It was a refrigerated trailer, a reefer pulled by a plain tractor, owner-operated, the kind of one-man rig that runs long, irregular routes all over the map. And the first thing that snagged Hollis's attention was the simplest thing in the world to him, the thing he lived for. The numbers didn't add up. The driver's logbook said one thing, but the way the truck kept turning up at Hollis's scales at 3, at 4 in the morning, headed one direction, and then, a few days later, the other, on a schedule that made no commercial sense, told a different story. A reefer hauling produce, or meat, runs to a rhythm. It goes where the freight is. On routes a man like Hollis understood in his bones. This one wandered. It ran at the wrong hours. It came and went on the corridor in a way that didn't match any honest load Hollis could think of. And the driver was wrong too. Hollis couldn't have told you how. The man was polite enough, quiet, never gave him trouble. But he was watchful, in a way that honest, tired men aren't. His hands, the way his eyes went to the back of his own trailer and then away, the way he answered Hollis's routine questions a half-second too smoothly, a man who'd rehearsed being ordinary. Once, and this was the thing that turned Hollis's vague unease into something colder once, when Hollis had him pulled around for a closer look at his paperwork, Hollis happened to glance up into the cab, and there was a woman's shoe on the floorboard, a single woman's shoe. And when Hollis's eyes caught on it, the driver said, easy as anything, that it was his daughter's. She'd ridden along last week. Kids leave things everywhere. And maybe that was true. Probably it was true. A single shoe is nothing. You can't do anything with a single shoe and a feeling. There was one other night that stayed with him, that he wrote down in more detail than the rest. It was a slow, dead stretch, around 4 in the morning, fog sitting low on the apron, and the reefer came through, And Hollis, acting on nothing but the cold thing in his gut, waved it onto the scale, and then around for an inspection he didn't strictly need to do. And the driver, who was always so smooth, so rehearsed ordinary, was not smooth that night. He was agitated. He didn't want to pull around. He had his hours. He had his paperwork. Why was Hollis singling him out? He had a schedule, and the reefer unit, the refrigeration on the trailer, was running hard on a night cool enough that a real load wouldn't have needed it going like that. And Hollis, who knew reefers, noticed the way he noticed everything. He stood there in the fog with the man's logbook in his hand, and the cooling unit roaring away on a cold night, and the driver too eager to be gone. And Hollis Bream felt all the way down that he was standing 3 feet from something monstrous and could not lay a hand on it. He checked the paperwork to the letter. He found a small violation, a logbook discrepancy, and he wrote the man up for it, the only thing the law gave him to do, and he made the driver sit there longer than he had to over it, just to watch him, just because it was the only power he had. And then he had to let the truck roll back out onto the interstate and into the fog, because a feeling is not a warrant, and a running cooler on a cold night is not a crime. He wrote it all down when he got back inside. The date, the time, the plate, the cooler running, the man's eyes. He underlined parts of it. And then he went home and didn't sleep, and Marion found him at the kitchen window again, watching the dawn come up like it owed him an answer. But Hollis Bream went home that morning and didn't sleep, and over his breakfast he was quiet in a way Marion hadn't seen. And when she asked him what was wrong, he said, "There's a truck. There's a driver. Something's not right about him, and I can't put my finger on it, and I can't do a thing about a feeling." He took it to his supervisor. He took it, once, to a state trooper who worked the same overnight stretch. And he got, from both, exactly what you'd expect, and what was, to be fair, the only reasonable answer. "Hollis, you've got a nervous driver with sloppy paperwork and a kid who leaves her shoes in the cab. That's not a crime. We can't pull a man out of his truck and tear it apart because his logbook's creative and he gives you a funny feeling. Bring me something I can act on." And Hollis didn't have anything he could act on. He had a feeling, and a wandering reefer, and a single shoe. So they did nothing, because there was nothing to do, and I don't fault them for it. The machinery of the law needs a thing to grab. Hollis was holding smoke. So Hollis Bream did the only thing a man like him knew how to do with smoke. He wrote it down. He started a notebook. A plain spiral notebook, the kind you buy 3 for $1. And every single time that reefer and a couple of others that pinged the same wrongness in him over the years came through his scales, Hollis wrote it down. The date, the time, the plate, the DOT number off the door, the direction it was headed, which way the man's eyes went, whether the logbook lied that night and how. For years, he filled one notebook and started another. It became, around the station, a gentle joke Hollis and his book. The younger inspectors ribbed him about it. His own supervisor, not unkindly, figured it was the harmless hobby of a meticulous old man with too many quiet hours on his hands, a way to feel like the long nights meant something. Marion worried about it a little. Truth be told, the way it sat on him, the way he'd get quiet about that one truck. She told him once, gently, that he couldn't carry every stranger on that highway home with him, that it would eat him up. And Hollis said he knew. And he kept the book anyway. He retired in 2003. They gave him a cake and a plaque, and the younger men shook his hand. And somebody made a joke about finally being free of Hollis's book, and everybody laughed, including Hollis. And the notebooks, years of them, went into a cardboard box, and the box went up into the attic of the house he shared with Marion, and Hollis Bream settled into being an old retired man who tended his tomatoes and had his breakfast at a civilized hour for the first time in 30 years. And he died in 2008. Quietly, a hard thing, in his sleep. A good, ordinary, decent man who had watched the trucks in the dark for 30 years and caught 100 liars and one feeling he could never do anything about. And I think Marion thought that the one truck stayed with him to the end. That, somewhere underneath the tomatoes and the breakfasts, Hollis Bream went to his grave quietly, believing that the worst thing he ever sensed on that highway had been nothing but an old man's imagination, that the book in the attic was just what they'd all said it was, a harmless obsession that never amounted to anything. It amounted to everything. He just wasn't there to find out. Because here is what was happening. Out there, on that interstate, all the years Hollis was writing in his book and being gently teased for it. Women were disappearing along that corridor, not in any one place. That was the thing. That was always the thing. A woman from a truck stop in one state. A hitchhiker last seen at an on-ramp 2 states away. A woman who worked the lots where the long-haul trucks park overnight, gone between one night and the next in a 3rd state entirely. Spread out across hundreds of miles and a dozen jurisdictions in a span of years, which is exactly why no one saw it as one thing. Each disappearance was a separate small tragedy, in a separate small file, in a separate office. And the women were the kind the world is slow to look for. Travelers, drifters, women living hard lives on the margins of the road, women whose absence took a long time to register and longer to investigate. It is one of the most chilling true things about the American highway, and I'll say it plainly because it matters. The interstate, with its endless motion, and its anonymous truck stops, and its rivers of strangers passing through, has been, for certain men, a kind of perfect machine for hunting. A man who is always moving, who crosses a new jurisdiction every few hours, who has a legitimate reason to be on every road at every hour. Such a man can do terrible things for a very long time, because the system was never built to see a pattern that moves. It took until the 2010s for a multi-state effort to finally lay those scattered files on one table, the way Mara Ellison once laid out 6 folders on a desert highway. You might remember, but bigger and across state lines. Investigators began to see the shape of it at last. One corridor, many years, a string of women, a pattern that moved. And the pattern, when they worked it, began to point at a long-haul trucker, an over-the-road man who'd run that interstate for decades. They had him, more or less, in their sights. But they had the hardest problem these cases always have: placing him. Tying one specific man to specific times and specific places across years and states, when all you've got is the ghost trail of a vehicle that's always in motion and rarely written down anywhere that lasts. And that is when somebody remembered that there had once been an old inspector at a way station on that very corridor who was famous, in a small way, for writing everything down. I don't know exactly how it came to them, whether an old report of Hollis's surfaced in a database, or whether one of the troopers from the old days remembered Hollis and his book. But a detective came, eventually, to a widow named Marion Bream and asked her, gently, whether her late husband had kept any records. And Marion Bream went up into the attic, and she brought down a cardboard box full of 3 for $1 spiral notebooks, years of them. And she gave them to the detective. She told me she nearly didn't believe him, the detective, when he explained what he was hoping for. After all those years of gently worrying that the book was just the thing eating a hole in her husband after telling Hollis, with love, that he couldn't save every stranger on that road. Here was a man from a multi-state task force, sitting in her kitchen, telling her that her husband's harmless obsession might be precisely what they'd been missing. She brought the box down herself. She set it on the kitchen table where Hollis had eaten 30 years of dawn breakfasts, and told her about the trucks. And she watched the detective open the first notebook and go very still over Hollis's small, careful handwriting, the dates, the plates, the times, the underlined parts, and she said she knew, from the way the man went quiet, the way you know. She said the only thing she could think, sitting there, was that she wished Hollis could see it, that the thing he'd carried to his grave believing was nothing was the something, after all. She'd spent years afraid the book was proof her husband couldn't let go of a ghost. It turned out the book was the ghost's undoing. She said she was proud of him in a way she didn't have words for, and grieved, all over again, that he wasn't there to be told. And in those notebooks was the thing the entire case had been missing, because for years, at one fixed point on that corridor, on the overnight shift, a meticulous old accountant of a man had written down by date, by time, by plate, by dot number, by direction of travel, every single time a certain wandering reefer and its watchful driver came through his scales. He had, without ever knowing it, kept the one detailed, dated, contemporaneous log of that truck's movements that existed anywhere in the world. A trucker's own paperwork can be cooked. His logbook lies. But Hollis Bream's book didn't lie, because Hollis Bream had no reason to, and every reason, in his careful soul, not to. His notebook placed that truck on that corridor, again and again, at the times and in the patterns that lined up, when the investigators finally laid it beside the disappearances, with a precision that no one had dared hope for. The dismissed obsession of a lonely night shift man became the spine of a case that crossed half a dozen states. The man was arrested. I'll leave his name out of it. He doesn't deserve to be the thing you remember from this. He was an old man by the time they took him, having run free on those roads for the better part of his life, and Hollis Bream's notebooks were a central reason that several families in several states, who had spent decades not knowing, finally got an answer about a daughter, a sister, a mother who had vanished off the highway and never come home. Marion Bream lived to see it, and the detective who'd taken that box down from the attic made very sure of one thing, made sure it was said out loud, in the places where it counted, that this case was broken open by a man named Hollis Bream, not a famous investigator, not a task force. A night shift way station inspector that the world had gently mocked for caring too much, for watching too closely, for writing it all down. The man who died believing his book was nothing. Marion said the hardest part, and the best part, all at once, was wishing he could have known. That the one thing that had quietly haunted him for 30 years, the truck he could never do anything about, he had, in fact, done the one thing about it that mattered. He'd borne witness. He'd kept the record. He'd refused to let what he'd seen go unwritten, even when every reasonable person told him it was nothing, even when he half believed them himself. And a long time later, when the world was finally ready to read it, his book was waiting. So that's the second thing I want you to carry tonight, riding along beside all those passing trucks in the dark. You watch things out here. You can't help it. It's the job. It's the hours. And every so often, something you see is going to sit wrong with you, and you won't be able to say why, and there'll be no one to tell, and nothing to do about it. The world will tell you it's nothing. You'll probably half believe it, but write it down anyway. Notice it anyway. Keep the record, even when it feels like the harmless habit of someone with too many quiet hours and no way to act. Because you do not know, you cannot know which of the things you noticed in the dark is going to turn out, long after you've stopped expecting it to matter, to be the most important thing anybody ever wrote down. Hollis Bream watched the trucks for 30 years. So watch, and write it down. That was the way station. We've got more night ahead of us, you and I. Stay with me. The next one comes off the highway for a little while, and into the warm light of an all-night diner just past the exit ramp, the kind with the bottomless coffee and the pie under glass, and the waitress who's seen every soul that ever came in off that road at 3 in the morning. She remembered all of them. But there was one customer, one ordinary night, who left something behind in a booth, and it would be 20 years before anybody understood what it was. But that's up the road away. For now, eyes on the line, hands on the wheel, and stay with me. We're a long way from morning yet, so let me take you into that diner now, out of the cold and into the light for a while. The westbound sat just off the interstate on the high plains, in a part of this country so flat and so empty that at night, the only lights for miles are the ones you bring with you. Out there, the dark isn't a color, it's a distance. It goes all the way to the edge of the world in every direction, and the wind never really stops. And the one warm lit-up window for 40 miles in any direction belonged to the westbound. Open all night, every night, because a truck stop has to be. Coffee that was never not on, pie turning slow under a plastic dome, cracked vinyl booths, the color of an old penny, the hum of the cooler, and the buzz of the sign, and, most nights, the particular quiet of a place where the few souls who come in off that road at 3 in the morning mostly just want to be left alone with their coffee and their thoughts. And working that graveyard shift, for the better part of 30 years, was a woman named Lorraine. Lorraine was the kind of waitress every all-night place used to have and hardly any do anymore. She remembered everybody, not in a nosy way, in a tending way. She remembered how you took your coffee, and whether you wanted to talk or be quiet, and she could tell, the second you came through the door out of the dark, which kind of night you were having. She'd poured 10,000 cups for 10,000 strangers passing through to somewhere else. And she'd made a quiet art of being kind to people she'd never see again. She figured that was most of what the job was, really. A warm place and a kind face for the people the night had out on the road alone. And Lorraine kept the lost and found. Every diner has one, a box, a drawer. Somewhere they toss the things people leave behind. Most places clean it out every few months. Lorraine never could. It went against something in her to throw away a thing somebody had carried in and lost. a pair of reading glasses, a paperback with the corner turned down, a child's mitten, a set of keys to a house she'd never see, in a town she'd never visit. To everybody else, it was junk. But Lorraine had a notion she never quite said out loud that you can't always tell, in the moment, what's junk and what's somebody's whole world. So she kept it all. Years of it. A great cardboard box in the back, and when that filled, another. The collected leavings of 3 decades of strangers passing through in the dark. This story is about one thing in that box. And the night it came in, it was a bitter night in the winter of 1998. The kind of cold that kills. Out on those plains, wind chilled down past anything a body should be out in. And a little after midnight, a young man came in. Lorraine put him at maybe 22, alone. And the second he came through the door, she knew, the way she knew things, that he was carrying something terrible. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't trouble, he was polite, soft-spoken, said thank you for the coffee. But he was hollowed out, exhausted in a way that goes deeper than missing sleep. He took the corner booth by the window, and he ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and then he just sat there. For hours. He barely touched the pie. He'd drink the coffee, and she'd refill it, and he'd let it go cold, and she'd warm it again. And the whole time he sat half-turned to the window, looking out at the black lot, at the highway beyond it, at the dark, like he was waiting for something to come out of it, or watching for someone, or just looking down a road he'd been on too long. Lorraine tried, gently, the way she did. Asked if he was headed far, if he was all right, if there was anything she could do, and he'd give her a small, polite, broken sort of smile, and say no, ma'am, he was fine, just tired, just passing through, and she let him be. Because you learn that some people's grief is a thing you can't touch, only sit near. So she kept his coffee warm, and she let him have the booth and the window and the dark, all the way till the sky started going grey. And then, near dawn, he paid. And he left her a tip that was too big for a man who looked like he had nothing. And he went out into the cold, and got in his car and drove off. West, into the last of the night. And he left something behind in the booth. Lorraine found it when she went to clear the table. A paperback book, sitting on the seat where he'd been. And when she picked it up, something slipped out of it, a photograph, the kind he'd been using to mark his place. A snapshot of a young woman, smiling, pretty, dark-haired, squinting a little into the sun, the way you do in an old photo, and Lorraine turned it over, the way you do, and on the back, in blue ballpoint, in a young man's careful hand, were a name and 3 words. The name was Annie, and the 3 words were, I'll find you. Lorraine figured he'd be back. People came back for things, sometimes, when they realized, turned around at the next exit, sheepish. So she set the book and the photo aside, where he'd see them if he came. But he didn't come back that morning, or that week, and after a while she put the paperback in the lost and found box with everything else. But the photograph, the smiling girl, and I'll find you on the back, in that careful hand, that one she couldn't quite file away with the mittens and the reading glasses. That one got to her. So she kept it tucked in the corner of the mirror in the break room, and then, when she changed jobs years later, in a little dish on her own dresser at home. The girl named Annie, and the promise on the back. For 20 years, she thought about them, on and off, all that time. The hollowed-out young man who'd sat at her window all night watching the dark. The smiling girl in the photo. I'll find you. Find who? Was Annie the girl in the picture? Or was Annie someone he was looking for, and the picture someone else? Was he running from something, or toward it? It was a small mystery, the kind you carry quietly, that surfaces now and then over the years, and then sinks again. Lorraine never expected an answer. People don't, usually. The road takes its strangers back, and keeps its secrets. And then, around 2018, 20 years on, she got one. It came on the news, and then in the paper, the way these things do now. A cold case, out of the same county, a set of unidentified remains, a young woman found out near that interstate back in 1996, and never named. Buried, like Della, under a stone with no name on it. And now, all those years later, the modern science had finally given her one. Forensic genetic genealogy, the same patient miracle I told you about earlier tonight. The family trees built backward out of distant cousins' DNA until they point at one missing branch. They'd given the girl by the highway her name back. Her name was Annie Cordell, and she had gone missing in 1995. And they ran her photograph, the way they do, so the public would know a young woman, dark-haired, smiling, squinting into the sun. And Lorraine, an old woman now, sitting with her morning coffee, looked at that photograph in the newspaper and went cold all over, because she had the same photograph. She had been looking at it, on her own dresser, for 20 years. The girl named Annie, the girl from the booth by the window. Lorraine called the number they give, and she told a detective named Reyes that she believed she had something. And Reyes came out to see her, the way you do when an old woman says she's been keeping a photo of your cold case victim on her dresser for 2 decades. And Lorraine told her the whole of it, the bitter night in 1998. The hollowed-out young man, the booth by the window, the photo with "I'll find you" on the back, and she handed it over. And here is what they were able to piece together once they pulled that thread. And I'll tell you now, it isn't what you're expecting. Because I bet that somewhere back there, when I described that haunted young man sitting all night watching the dark, some part of you did exactly what an investigator's first instinct does, what the whole genre trains you to do. You wondered if he was the one who'd done it. The guilty man, haunted, fleeing, carrying his victim's photo. It would fit. It's the shape these stories usually take. It wasn't that at all. Annie Cordell had a younger brother. His name was Wes. And when Annie vanished in 1995, she'd been traveling that corridor the way young people did, and she simply never came home. Wes Cordell could not accept it. Their mother grieved, and the police took the report and could do little with a grown woman who'd gone out on the road of her own free will. And the world, in its way, started to move on. But Wes didn't. Wes was younger than Annie, and he'd worshipped her, and he made it his whole life to find her. He drove that corridor for years. He'd take time off work, or lose jobs over it, and he'd drive the interstate where she'd last been seen, stopping at every truck stop, and every gas station, and every all-night diner along it, showing her photograph, asking, "Have you seen this girl?" Asking. He'd written, "I'll find you" on the back of the only good photo he had of her, a vow, to her and to himself, the night he sat in Lorraine's diner. In the winter of 1998, he was 3 years into that search. 3 years of driving that dark road, showing that photo, getting nowhere. He was at the bottom of it. And he was sitting in a booth by a window, watching the highway where his sister had vanished, not knowing, because how could he, that Annie's body had already been found 2 years before, less than 40 miles from where he sat. That she was already in the ground, a Jane Doe with no name, while her brother drove past her in the dark, year after year, looking for her among the living. He left her photo in that booth, maybe by accident, in his exhaustion. Maybe, and I choose to believe this, because some part of a man that worn down had started, without admitting it, to let go. And not long after that night in the early spring of 1999, Wes Cordell died. On that same highway. A single-car wreck, late on a stretch of black ice. A young man driving the road he'd driven 100 times, looking for a sister he was never going to find. He died, still searching. He died, not knowing she'd been found and lost again years before. Both of Ada Cordell's children, taken by that one road, Annie to whoever it was that took her, and the honest truth is they were never certain who. Investigators came to believe she'd crossed paths with one of the transient predators who worked that corridor, perhaps tied to other cases, but no one was ever charged, and I won't pretend otherwise tonight. And Wes, to the searching itself. A mother who lost a daughter to the highway, and then lost the son who spent his life trying to bring her back. Ada Cordell was very old by 2018, but she was still living, and she was the one they finally got to tell. After 23 years, Ada learned what had become of Annie, that she'd been found and named at last, and could be properly laid to rest under her own name. And then Detective Reyes did one more thing. She brought Ada the photograph, the one Lorraine had kept on her dresser for 20 years. And she told Ada where it had come from, that her son Wes had carried it across all those miles and all those years, that he'd written "I'll find you" on the back of it in his own hand, that he'd been seen one bitter night in 1998, sitting in a warm diner with it, still looking, and that a kind stranger named Lorraine had picked it up off a vinyl booth and kept it safe for 2 decades, not knowing why. only knowing she couldn't throw it away. Ada Cordell held the photograph of her daughter, with her dead son's promise on the back of it, and I am told she wept in a way that had been waiting 23 years to come out. Because here was the proof of it. Not just what happened to Annie, but how hard Wes had tried, how fiercely her boy had loved his sister. He hadn't found her in life, but the photo he left behind in a diner, kept by a stranger, became one of the threads that finally did. He kept his promise. Just not the way he meant to, and not in time for him to know it. So that's what I'll leave you with, on this one. Before we get back on the road, there's a box in the back of 1,000 all-night places along these highways, full of the things people leave behind. Gloves and paperbacks and photographs and keys. Junk, mostly. Forgotten the moment it's lost, but not all of it. Every so often, one of those forgotten things is somebody's whole heart, set down by accident on a vinyl seat at 4 in the morning by a person carrying more than they can hold. And every so often, there's a Lorraine, somebody kind enough or stubborn enough to keep what the rest of the world would throw away on nothing but a feeling that it might matter to someone someday. It mattered. It gave a grieving mother her children back, both of them. The whole sad story of them 20 years on. And do me one favor, out there in the dark tonight, when you pass a stranger who looks hollowed out, haunted, carrying something terrible, don't be so quick to decide what it is. We're trained to look at the haunted man in the corner and see a guilty one. But Wes Cordell wasn't guilty of anything but loving his sister past the point it could save either of them. The most haunted face in this whole story belonged to the most loving man in it. Grief, from the outside, looks an awful lot like guilt. Try to remember the difference. That was the booth by the window, the girl named Annie, and the brother who never stopped looking. Let me say one quick thing here, and then I'll get us back on the road and won't bother you with it again. We're about halfway through the night now, you and I, and if you've come this far with me, if these stories have been good company out there in the dark, then somewhere down the road, whenever you're parked and the engine's off and it's safe, I'd be grateful if you'd hit subscribe. That's the whole of the ask. Not now. Now you just drive. But later, when the wheels aren't turning, it's the one small thing that lets me keep making these and keep riding along with you on the long nights. Thank you for being here, truly. Now let's get back to it. This next one is a different kind of cold. I've told you about the dark tonight, and the empty road, and the loneliness of the long miles. But I haven't told you yet about the worst thing the road can throw at the people who drive it, which isn't the dark, and isn't a stranger. It's the weather. And the worst of the weather, the thing that has killed more travelers on these highways than any human hand ever will, is snow. This one is called whiteout. If you've never driven in a real blizzard, a true ground blizzard, out on the open plains, where the wind picks the fallen snow up off the ground and throws it back at you so thick you can't see your own hood, then I hope you never have to. The people who have will tell you it's like being struck blind. The world just goes white. You lose the road, you lose the sky, you lose any sense of which way is which. People die a mile from a town they can't see. They die 30 feet from their own front door. They run their cars off into the ditch without ever knowing the ditch was there. And then the drifts come up over the windows, and the warm, safe car becomes a cold, white tomb, and the storm erases the tracks behind them like they were never there at all. And on a brutal February night, on a long, lonely stretch of interstate up in the northern plains, North Dakota, near enough, the worst blizzard in 20 years came down on that highway like the end of the world. They closed the road, eventually. But by the time they closed it, it was already too late for the cars that were on it. Dozens of them, caught out in the open when the whiteout hit, slewing off into the ditches and the median, going dark and getting buried, one after another, strung out for miles along a road that had simply vanished into the white. And the last man out on that road, the one man still moving when everything else had stopped, was a snowplow operator named Curtis Lund. Curtis had been plowing those highways for going on 25 years, and he knew that storm was a killer the moment it came down. He also knew something most folks don't think about, that in a blizzard, the plow driver is very often the only thing standing between a stranded motorist and death. There's no one else out there. The tow trucks can't run, the ambulances can't run, the troopers pull back because they'll die too. But the plow has to try to keep at least one lane open, and the plow has height and lights and a heated cab and a radio. And so the man in the plow becomes, by default, the search party, the rescue, and the last lifeline all at once. Curtis had pulled people out of drifts before. Every veteran plow driver has. It's part of the job nobody puts in the job description. That night, Curtis worked that highway for hours in near-zero visibility, creeping along at a walking pace, his lights barely reaching the front of his own blade. And every time his headlights caught the shape of a buried car, off in the ditch, just a hump in the snow, an antenna, a dark edge of a roof, he'd stop, and he'd radio the location in, and then he'd climb down into that screaming wind and fight his way over to the car, and knock on the window, and get whoever was inside up into the warm cab of the plow. Car after car, an elderly couple, nearly frozen, who'd been buried for 3 hours. A trucker who'd jackknifed and was fine but stuck. A family of 4 who'd run out of gas, keeping warm. He filled that plow cab with shivering, grateful, half-frozen strangers and ran them, a load at a time, to the one open exit, and the truck stopped there, and then he turned around and went back out into the white for more. And then, far out on the loneliest part of the stretch, his lights caught one more buried car, off in the median, nearly gone under a drift. And Curtis stopped, and radioed it, and went down into the storm, and dug at the door, and got it open. And inside that cold, dark car, alone, was a little girl. She was maybe 5 years old. Bundled in a coat too thin for that car with its dead engine, shaking so hard she could barely talk, her lips going the color they go. And there was no one else in the car, no adult, just a little girl, by herself, in a dead car, in the middle of the worst blizzard in 20 years, on an empty interstate in the dark. Curtis got her up into his arms and up into the warm cab and wrapped in everything he had. And as she thawed and the shaking eased, he asked her, gentle as he could over the roar of the wind, where her mama was, where her daddy was, who'd been driving. And the little girl said her daddy had gone to get gas. That they'd been driving a long, long time, for days. And the car stopped, and her daddy told her to stay put and be a good girl, and he'd be right back with gas. And he went out into the snow, and that had been she didn't know how long. A long time. Long enough that the car had gone cold around her. Long enough that a 5-year-old had been sitting alone in the dark in a dying car in a blizzard, waiting for a daddy who hadn't come back. Now Curtis Lund had been doing this a long time, and something about it sat wrong with him right away, under the relief of having found her. You don't leave a 5-year-old alone in a car in a whiteout to walk for gas, not if you're in your right mind, not if there's any other choice, and not for as long as this little girl had been left. And there was something else. The way she talked about the days of driving. The way she got quiet and scared when he asked about her mama. So Curtis did the thing the job had taught him. He got on the radio, and along with the location and the rescue, he read off the car's license plate, slow and clear, and he told the dispatcher there was a child alone, and asked them to run it, and to find out if anybody was looking for a little girl. Somebody was. Because 2 days before that blizzard, in another state, a little girl had been taken. Her name was Emma, and the man who took her was her father, a man who did not have custody of her, who had been ordered by a court to stay away, and who had instead shown up and taken his daughter and run. He'd been driving for 2 days, fleeing across state lines with Emma in the car, when the worst storm in 20 years came down on the highway in front of him and swallowed it whole. His car died in a drift in the median. And whatever was in that man's head by then, panic, or cowardice, or some desperate broken idea of getting help, or getting away, he left his own 5-year-old daughter alone in that dead, freezing car, and he walked off into the whiteout. There had been an alert out for Emma for 2 days. Her mother was frantic. The whole machinery of a missing child search was grinding away 2 states wide. And none of it would have meant a thing that night, because nobody on Earth knew that the car they were looking for was buried in a median, in a North Dakota blizzard. Nobody, except the one plow driver creeping down that erased highway, who found a hump of snow with an antenna sticking out of it and decided to go and knock. Emma lived. Curtis got her warm, and got her to the truck stop, and got her into the hands of the troopers who came when the storm finally let up enough to let anyone move. She was cold, and she was scared, and she'd been through something no child should go through, but she lived. The blizzard that should have killed her was, instead, the thing that saved her, because by stranding her father's car, it stopped a man who was running with a child the whole country was searching for, and it put her, by the grace of a snowplow's headlights, into the arms of a man who'd spent 25 years learning to go and check the buried cars. They found the father, too. The same storm that trapped his daughter trapped him. He hadn't gotten far on foot in that whiteout, no one could have, and he was picked up not long after, half frozen himself, and he answered for what he'd done. I'll let you sit with your own feelings about a man who leaves a 5-year-old alone in a freezing car to save his own skin. Mine aren't generous, and I expect yours aren't either. But I don't want to leave you with him. I want to leave you with Curtis. Because Curtis Lund didn't think he'd done anything special that night. That's the thing about the people who do these jobs. He'd tell you, he did tell people, the few times it came up that he was just doing his route, that any plow driver would have stopped at that car. Because you stop at all of them, that's the whole job. You go and you knock. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a man who plows snow, who happened to be the one still out there, who happened to look in the right buried car. And Emma's mother, who got her daughter back 2 days after losing her, in the middle of a blizzard, because a stranger went and knocked on a frozen window. Emma's mother did not see it as just a route. She saw it the way you'd see it. As the entire world. Emma grew up, safe and loved, and a long way from that night. And years later, when she was old enough to understand what had happened and who had found her, she went and found Curtis Lund, and she thanked him, the man whose face she'd been too cold and too little to remember, the man who dug her out of the dark. I won't make a long scene of it. I'll just tell you that an old plow driver who'd always insisted he was nothing special got to sit across from a grown young woman who was alive because of him, and got to understand, maybe for the first time, that the route he'd run for 25 years had been, all along, a kind of guardianship, that every buried car he ever knocked on had somebody's whole life inside it. So here's the last thing. Before we get back out on the road, there are people whose whole job is to keep these roads open, the plow drivers, the night crews, the ones out in the weather that sends the rest of us home. We don't think about them. We curse the plow for being slow when we're stuck behind it. But on the worst nights, out on the worst roads, those are the people standing between a stranger and the white dark. They go and they knock on the buried cars. And every so often, behind one of those frozen windows, there's a little girl alone, waiting for someone to come. Curtis Lund went and knocked. So if you're one of those people, if you run the plow, or the wrecker, or the night route in the weather, nobody else will drive. I want you to know that somebody out here knows what you are. You're not just clearing a road. Some nights, you're the only one coming. That was whiteout. We've got more night left, and I'm not done with you yet. Stay with me. The next one takes us onto a long, lonely turnpike, and into the little glass booth at the midnight toll plaza, and to the woman who worked that window in the small hours and watched every car in the world go by, one at a time, close enough to see their faces. Most nights it was nothing. The same headlights, the same sleepy drivers, the same handful of coins. But there was one night she never forgot, the night the same car came through her lane 3 separate times, going the same direction. Every time. But that's up the road. For now, keep your eyes on the line, your hands on the wheel, and stay with me. Morning's still a ways off, and I'll be right here the whole way. There's a strange intimacy to a toll booth in the middle of the night. If you've driven the big eastern turnpikes, the ones that roll on for hundreds of miles through the dark mountains of Pennsylvania, or the flat black stretches of Ohio, you know the ones I mean. These days, it's mostly cameras and transponders. You don't even slow down. But not that long ago, every few dozen miles, you had to stop. You had to roll down your window, letting the bitter cold or the thick summer humidity into the cab, and you had to hand a few pieces of silver to a human being standing in a lit-up glass box. For 3 seconds, you and that toll collector were the only 2 people awake in the world. They saw the bags under your eyes. They saw the fast food wrappers on the passenger seat. They saw the sleeping kids in the back, or the way you gripped the wheel, or the fact that you were crying. And then the gate went up, and you drove away, and you were strangers again. A woman named Helen worked the eastbound window at Plaza 42 on one of those turnpikes for 14 years. She was a fixture on the midnight to 8 shift. She liked the quiet. She liked the heater humming in the little booth, the smell of the diesel exhaust in the cold air, the rhythmic, mindless work of making change. Helen was a mother of 3 grown boys, a grandmother to 4, and she had the kind of sharp, unsentimental empathy that comes from raising loud kids on a tight budget. She didn't scare easily. She didn't pry. She just took your money, told you to drive safe, and let you go. But you stand in a glass box on a dark highway for 14 years, and you learn to read the cars the way Hollis Bream learned to read the trucks. It was a Tuesday night in November of 1994, a cold, wet night. The kind where the rain looks like static in the orange glow of the highway lamps. The traffic was thin, a long-haul truck every 10 minutes, a lonely sedan every 20. At 2:15 inches the morning, a dark blue Chevy Nova pulled into Helen's lane. Helen held out her hand. The driver handed her a damp dollar bill. He was a man in his 30s, wearing a faded flannel shirt, and he didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming a frantic, silent rhythm against the steering column. Helen made change, handed it back, said, "Have a safe night." The man snatched the coins, didn't say a word, and punched the gas before the gate was entirely up. The Nova sped off into the eastbound dark. Helen forgot him instantly. You see 100 tense, rude drivers a week. It's the nature of the road. People want to get where they're going. She poured herself a cup of thermos coffee, did a crossword puzzle, and watched the rain. An hour and 20 minutes later, at 3:35 a.m., headlights pulled out of the dark and into her lane. A dark blue Chevy Nova. Helen held out her hand. The driver pressed $1 into it. It was the same man, the same faded flannel shirt, the same frantic drumming on the steering column, the same dead-ahead, unblinking stare. Now, I want you to think about the geography of a turnpike for a second. It is a closed system. It is a straight line. You get on, you drive east, you get off. To come through Helen's eastbound toll booth, you have to be driving east. To come through Helen's eastbound toll booth twice in an hour and a half, you have to drive past her, go 10 miles down the dark highway to the next exit, pay that toll, get off the turnpike, navigate the twisting local backroads in the dead of night, to loop all the way back west, get back on the turnpike at the previous interchange, and drive east to come through Helen's lane a second time. It's an hour of driving just to end up exactly where you started. Nobody does that by accident. You don't get lost on a turnpike. When Helen handed the man his change, she looked at him closer. He wasn't just tense. He was drenched in sweat. On a freezing November night, with the car heater blasting, there were beads of sweat rolling down the side of his face. He grabbed the coins, tires spinning on the wet concrete, and shot back out into the eastbound dark. Helen stood in her lit-up box, her hand still raised in the air, listening to the engine fade. A cold feeling, heavy as a stone, dropped into her stomach. People who loop the turnpike at 3 in the morning are looking for something, or they are trying to undo something. Helen wrote the license plate down on the back of a blank toll receipt. She didn't call the troopers yet. Like Hollis with his notebook, you can't dispatch a state trooper because a man has a bad sense of direction and a sweating problem. It's not illegal to drive in circles. She told herself there was a logical explanation. Maybe he dropped his wallet at a rest stop. Maybe he missed his exit and was too turned around to realize he was looping. She went back to her crossword, but she couldn't focus on the words. She kept looking out at the black stretch of the eastbound lanes, swallowed by the rain. At 5:10 a.m., the Chevy Nova came into her lane for the third time, 3 times, eastbound, meaning he had done the 10-mile loop, out in the dark, all over again. This time, Helen didn't just hold out her hand. This time, she leaned out the window. She needed to see inside that car. The man handed her $1. His hand was shaking, not a little tremble, the violent, uncontrollable tremor of a man whose adrenaline has burned through his system and left him running on pure panic. And when Helen looked past him, into the dark interior of the car, she noticed 2 things. The passenger side door wasn't shut all the way. The interior dome light was off, but she could see the gap in the frame, the slight rattle of the metal, and the man's knuckles, gripping the dollar bill, were smeared with thick, dark mud, and something else. Something that looked like rust, but wasn't. Helen took the $1, and then she did a very brave, very quiet thing. She accidentally dropped a quarter of his change. It hit the side of the car and clattered under the tires. "Oh, sweetheart, I am so sorry," Helen said, her voice dripping with grandmotherly apology. "Hold on, let me get another one from the drawer. My hands are stiff tonight." She turned her back to him. It forced him to sit there for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, in the harsh fluorescent light of the toll plaza. "Keep it," the man yelled, his voice cracking. "Just open the gate." "I've got it right here, hun," Helen said, turning back around. And in that extra moment, she looked him dead in the eyes. She said later, it was like looking at an animal backed into a corner. He wasn't looking at her as a person. He was looking at her as an obstacle. There was a frantic, terrifying emptiness in his face. He wasn't looking for a lost wallet. He was hunting. Helen hit the button. The gate went up. The Nova tore out of the plaza so fast the back end fishtailed on the wet pavement. The second the taillights disappeared, Helen picked up the heavy black radio receiver on her desk and called the Turnpike Authority state troopers. She didn't just give them the plate. She told the dispatcher, "Listen to me. There is a blue Chevy Nova headed east from Plaza 42. He has come through my lane 3 times since 2 in the morning. He is looping the 10-mile stretch between here and exit 44. His passenger door is ajar. He has blood on his hands, and he is looking for something he lost out there. You need to stop him, and you need to send cars to the shoulder of those 10 miles right now." State troopers who work the turnpike at night know the toll collectors. They trust them. When a 14-year veteran of the graveyard shift tells you something is wrong, you don't ask for a penal code. You put the lights on. 2 cruisers intercepted the Chevy Nova 3 miles east of Helen's Plaza. They found the car idling on the gravel shoulder, headlights cutting into the dense, rain-soaked woods that lined the highway. The man was out of the car. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, holding a heavy tire iron, staring into the dark. When the troopers lit him up, he dropped the iron and fell to his knees. He didn't even run. He was out of gas, in every sense of the word. But the troopers didn't just arrest him. They remembered what Helen had said. He is looking for something he lost. They got the dogs out. They got the big flashlights out. They walked into those wet, freezing woods, fanning out from where the Nova had parked. It took them an hour. The sun was just starting to turn the rain gray when one of the dogs hit on a scent near a concrete drainage culvert, 100 yards deep into the trees. Huddled inside that pipe, shivering so violently she couldn't speak, was a 20-year-old college student named Maya. She had been hitchhiking, a bad decision she'd made because her own car had broken down and she was trying to get back to campus for a morning exam. The man in the Nova had picked her up. He had seemed nice for about 20 minutes, and then he hadn't. When the car had slowed down to navigate a construction zone a few miles past Helen's Plaza, Maya had done the only thing she could think to do. She had opened the passenger door, thrown herself out of the moving car into the gravel, scrambled up the embankment, and run blindly into the dark woods. The man had stopped. He had chased her into the trees. That's where the mud and the blood on his knuckles came from fighting through the briars and slipping in the ravine. But he couldn't find her in the pitch black. So he went back to his car. But he knew she couldn't run far in the freezing rain. He knew she was trapped in that 10-mile stretch of woods between the exits. So he drove to the next exit. He looped back around, and he started driving that stretch again, creeping along the shoulder, looking for her to emerge, over and over. 3 times through Helen's lane. If he had found her before the troopers got there, I wouldn't be telling you this story. I'd be telling you a much darker one. Maya survived. She spent a week in the hospital with hypothermia and a broken collarbone from the fall, but she lived. The man went to prison for a very long time. And Helen? Helen finished her shift. She logged off at 8 in the morning, drove home, made herself some eggs, and slept. She never met Maya. She didn't want to. She told a local reporter, who tracked her down a few weeks later, that she was just doing her job, handing out change, watching the cars. But I want you to think about what Helen actually did. We move through this world so fast. We lock our doors, we roll up our windows, we treat the people in the service booths, and the diner counters and the way stations like they are just part of the machinery of the road. We think we are invisible in our cars. But we aren't. There is always someone watching. If Helen had been looking at a magazine, if Helen hadn't cared enough to remember a face from an hour before, if Helen hadn't possessed the brass nerve to drop a quarter to buy herself 5 seconds of looking a monster in the eye, a girl would have died in a drainage pipe in the freezing rain, and a man would have driven away into the morning light. So tonight, when you pass through a toll, or pull up to a drive-through window at 3 a.m., or hand your card to a tired cashier at a brightly lit gas station in the middle of nowhere, look at them, nod your head, acknowledge them, because they are the sentinels of this highway. They are the ones who keep the lights on while the rest of the world sleeps. And sometimes, they are the only thing standing between a long, dark road and a terrible end. That was the toll plaza. Take a breath. Stretch your hands on the wheel. We've got miles to make before the sun comes up, and the stories aren't over. This next one takes us off the pavement entirely. It takes us into a small, cinder block building at the base of a massive steel tower, out in the high desert of Nevada. It's about a voice in the dark. For a lot of people driving the graveyard shift, the only company they have in the cab is the radio, the overnight AM stations. The talk shows that run from midnight to dawn, beamed out across half the country on clear nights, bouncing off the ionosphere so a trucker in Wyoming can hear a caller in Texas. It's a community of the sleepless. And for 15 years, a man named Artie was the voice they listened to. Artie worked the overnight shift at a station whose signal blanketed the western deserts. He took calls from insomniacs, conspiracy theorists, graveyard shift security guards, and lonely people who just wanted to hear another human voice say their name. Artie prided himself on never hanging up on anybody. He said the night was too big to leave a person hanging on a deadline. But there was one night in 2004 when a call came in that wasn't an insomniac, and it wasn't a prank. It was a driver, a young guy, calling from a cell phone which was rare back then, out in the dead zones of the desert. The reception was crackling, fading in and out, and the young man said, "Artie, I'm on Route 50, the loneliest road, and there's a pair of headlights behind me. They've been behind me for 60 miles, and every time I speed up, they speed up. Every time I turn my lights off to hide in the dark, they turn theirs off too." Artie thought it was a joke at first, a campfire story for the radio. But then he heard the panic in the kid's breath. He heard the engine of the caller's car screaming in the background, pushed past the red line. And then the kid said the thing that made Artie's blood run cold. "Artie, they're not just following me, they're talking to me." But that's coming up. Keep your eyes on the line. The dark is deep out here, but you're not driving it alone. Stay with me. Let me take you out to Nevada. If you haven't driven out west, you need to understand that the dark out there is different from the dark in the east. In the east, the dark is crowded. There are trees, towns, overpasses, light pollution bleeding up from the horizon. But out in the high desert of Nevada, on US Route 50, the highway they literally call the loneliest road in America, the dark is absolute. It is an ocean. You can drive for 2 hours at 80 miles an hour and not see a single house, a single street lamp, or another pair of taillights. It is just you, the yellow line, and the sagebrush stretching out to the edge of the world. And beaming out into all that empty space was Artie. Artie broadcast out of a cinder block station sitting in the dirt just outside of Tonopah. 50,000 watts of AM radio cutting through the cold desert night. For 15 years, Artie was the patron saint of the graveyard shift. Truckers, night watchmen, restless souls, they all tuned in. Artie had a voice like crushed velvet and a rule that he never hung up on a caller. "The night's too big," he used to say. "You don't leave a man hanging on a dead line." It was around 3 a.m. on a moonless Tuesday when the call came in. The connection was awful. Cell phones were still new enough then that out in the basin and range country, getting a signal was practically a miracle. The voice on the other end was fractured by static, warbling in and out. "Artie, Artie, can you hear me?" "I hear you, caller," Artie said, leaning into the mic. "You're breaking up a little, but I've got you. What's your name, and where are you headed?" "My name is David. I'm on Route 50, heading east, past Austin." The kid sounded young, maybe 19, and he was terrified. You don't fake that kind of breathlessness. The tight, shallow panting of a rabbit in a snare. "Take a breath, David," Artie said. His voice was calm, anchoring. "What's going on out there, on the loneliest road?" "There's a car behind me, Artie. I don't know what it is. A truck, an SUV. It's just 2 headlights, high beams. They've been behind me for 60 miles. If I do 60, they do 60. I pushed it up to 90, they stayed right on my bumper. 5 minutes ago, I turned my lights off, completely driving blind in the pitch black, just to lose them. And they turned theirs off, too. We were just doing 80 miles an hour in the pitch dark, Artie." Millions of people were listening to this. In truck cabs in Wyoming, in toll booths in Ohio, in kitchens in California. The whole country got very quiet. "All right, David," Artie said. "Have you tried dialing 911? I don't have the signal for it. I don't know why this call to you is even holding. But Artie. That's not the worst part. The static washed over the line like a wave, hissing and popping, before David's voice pushed back through. They're not just following me, they're talking to me. Artie frowned, looking through the soundproof glass of his booth out into the black desert. What do you mean they're talking to you? How? I bought a cheap CB radio at a Flying J back in Reno, plugged it into the cigarette lighter, just to listen to the truckers in case of weather. For the last 20 miles, a man has been talking on channel 19. He's not yelling, he's just narrating what I'm doing. David swallowed hard. The sound echoed over 50,000 watts. He just said, "You're gripping the wheel awfully tight, David." He said, "Your left taillight is flickering." Artie, my taillight is flickering. And then, 2 minutes ago, he keyed the mic and whispered, "You're running low on gas. The needle's dipping. Where are you going to go when the engine quits?" Artie felt the hair on his arms stand up. The stalker wasn't just following. He was close enough to see the glow of the dashboard gauges through David's rear window. He was playing with him, hunting him. "David, listen to me," Artie said. The late-night radio persona dropped completely. This wasn't a show anymore. Do not stop. I don't care if the needle hits the E, you keep your foot on the floor. Do you know where you are? Give me a mile marker. I just passed a green sign. It said Eureka was 40 miles away. I think it was mile marker 42. Okay, you're past the pass. It's a straight shot. Artie reached over and cranked the gain on his microphone. He leaned in so close, his lips brushed the foam. And then he spoke, not to David, but to the night. If you are rolling on US Route 50 tonight, if you are anywhere between Austin and Eureka, I need you to put the hammer down. We have a driver in distress eastbound at mile marker 42. He is being hunted. We need steel on that road, right now. On the phone line, David let out a sudden, sharp cry. He bumped me. Artie, he just rammed my bumper. The screech of tires bled through the phone. Hold the wheel, David, Artie barked. Keep it on the asphalt. He's pulling alongside me. And then, the sound of tearing metal. A dull, heavy thud, and the line went dead. Just the flat, digital hum of a dropped signal. In the radio business, dead air is the ultimate sin. You are taught to talk, to fill the silence. But for 10 seconds, Artie sat in his cinder block studio and didn't say a word. He just listened to the hum, staring at the flashing red light on his console. 2 million people across North America were holding their breath. "David?" Artie said softly. "Nothing." "If anyone is out there," Artie pleaded, his voice cracking just a fraction. "Please." The phone board lit up. Not David's line, the toll-free studio line. Artie punched the blinking button. "You're on the air." "Artie, this is Big John. I'm hauling timber out of Oregon, heading west on 50. It was a trucker." His voice was deep, gravelly, and entirely calm. "I just passed mile marker 50. John, do you see him?" "I see him, Artie. They're about a mile ahead of me. I got a visual. Looks like a little Honda Civic, getting run off the shoulder by a dark-colored heavy-duty pickup with a brush guard. Is the kid still on the road? He's fighting it. He's doing good. But the truck is trying to pit maneuver him into the ditch. Hang on, Artie." Over the radio, millions of people heard the deafening, bone-rattling blast of a semi-truck's air horn, a sustained, furious roar of compressed air. "I just woke everybody up from here to Salt Lake," Big John muttered. "I'm pushing 85 miles an hour, Artie. I'm crossing the center line. I got my brights on, my light bars on. I'm lighting up the whole damn desert. John, what's happening?" "I ain't the only one who listens to your show, Artie." A new sound came through the phone, a low, thrumming vibration, the sound of massive diesel engines. "I got a flatbed hauler coming up fast behind me," Big John narrated, his voice steady. "And I see headlights cresting the ridge up ahead, coming east behind the kid. It's a tanker rig. Out in the middle of the deepest, emptiest dark in America, a net was closing. We got him boxed, Artie," John said. "Tankers taking up the eastbound lanes. I'm taking up the westbound. Flatbeds closing the rear. We're a rolling roadblock." Artie gripped the edge of his desk. "What's the truck doing?" He realizes what's happening. The predator just became the prey. John let out a low, grim chuckle. "He's braking. He's smoking his tires, trying to stop. But I got 80,000 pounds of pine behind me, and I ain't touching my brakes. He's either going to eat my grill, or he's going in the dirt. There was a tense, agonizing silence. He took the dirt, John announced. Pickup swerved off the asphalt, tore through the sagebrush. He's doing a U-turn in the dust. Lights out. He's running south into the flats. And David? Artie asked, his heart hammering in his throat. The little Honda is stopped in the middle of the road. Tanker rig is parked right in front of him. I'm pulling up alongside him now. Air brakes engaged. Over the phone line, Artie heard the heavy psst of the semi's brakes. He heard the heavy thud of a truck door opening and Big John's boots hitting the asphalt. "Hey, kid," John's voice echoed in the distance. "You Artie's boy." A faint, trembling voice answered. Then, Big John picked the phone back up. "He's shaking like a leaf, Artie. Car's a little banged up on the quarter panel, but he's okay. We got him." Artie slumped back in his chair. He wiped a hand over his face, realizing he was sweating just as hard as the kid. "John, you stay with him. You don't leave him." "Ain't leaving him, Artie. Me and the tanker are going to sandwich him. We're going to escort him all the way into Ely, buy him a cup of coffee. He ain't driving another inch alone tonight." "Thank you, John. Thank you to the tanker and the flatbed, you boys." Artie swallowed hard. "You're the kings of the road tonight." "Just looking out for our own, Artie. Keep the mic hot for us. We're headed east." They escorted David all the way to the diner in Ely. 3 massive big rigs wrapped around one battered little Honda Civic. A convoy of steel and light cutting through the Nevada dark. Artie stayed on the air, playing old blues tracks, dedicating every single one of them to the men holding the line on Route 50. They never caught the guy in the pickup. When the sun came up, the state troopers found tire tracks tearing off into the salt flats, disappearing into the vast, unmapped thousands of acres of BLM land. Whoever it was, whatever his intentions were, he slipped back into the dark he came from. But I don't care about him. He's not the point of the story. The point is the radio. We think of technology as an isolating thing. We get into our metal boxes, we roll up the windows, we tune out the world. But out there, where the geography is hostile and the emptiness is heavy enough to crush you, a voice on the radio is a tether. It is a rope tied around your waist, leading back to the world of the living. When that boy was terrified, running out of gas, hunted by a ghost in the desert, he didn't have a weapon. He didn't have a police escort. He had an AM radio signal bouncing off the atmosphere, and that was enough. Because on the other end of that signal were a million strangers who worked the graveyard shift, people who understood the vulnerability of the dark. So if you are out there right now, driving through a stretch where the cell service dies and the only light is the throw of your own headlamps, look down at your radio. Look at the numbers glowing on the dash. You are not as alone as you think you are. There is a whole invisible empire of the sleepless riding right alongside you. And if you put out a call into the dark, you might be surprised by the size of the things that come out of the night to answer it. That was the voice on Route 50. We're getting closer to morning, but the sky is still black. Keep your hands loose on the wheel. We have one more stop to make before the sun comes up. Stay with me. We are on the final stretch now. If you look out your window, out past the tree line, or across the flats, you won't see it yet, but you can feel it. The dark is getting brittle. We are in the hour of the wolf, that heavy, dragging stretch of time between 4 and 5 in the morning, when the body wants nothing more than to shut down, and the highway feels like it goes on forever. This is the hardest part of the drive. But you're almost there, and I have one last story for you before the sun comes up. This one isn't about the people who watch the road, or the people who patrol it. It's about the people who carry the things we send down it. Let me tell you about a man named Elias, and the longest delivery in the history of the interstate. Elias drove a semi for the United States Postal Service, a dedicated contractor route. 5 nights a week, for 22 years, Elias hauled a 53-foot trailer full of mail from a massive sorting facility in Atlanta up through the twisting, fog-choked passes of the Blue Ridge Mountains to a hub in Virginia. Elias was a quiet, solitary man, an army veteran who liked the order of things. But more than that, Elias had a deep, almost religious reverence for what was in the back of his truck. He knew that amidst all the junk mail and the catalogs and the bills, there were pieces of people's lives in those canvas bins. Birth announcements, condolence letters, checks that were going to save somebody's house, apologies that took years to write. To Elias, he wasn't just driving a truck, he was keeping the blood pumping through the veins of the country. It was an October night in 1992. The kind of night in the Appalachians where the fog is so thick it looks like packed cotton, and the dampness seeps right through the floorboards of the cab. Elias was taking a long, winding downgrade, a notorious stretch of mountain highway, with a sharp curve at the bottom, known to locals as the Devil's Elbow. As Elias brought his rig around the curve, riding the Jake brake to keep his speed down, his headlights swept across the guardrail, or rather, where the guardrail was supposed to be. A 30-foot section of the heavy steel ribbon had been sheared clean off, and the wet asphalt leading up to the edge was scored with fresh, black skid marks. Elias pulled his massive rig onto the narrow shoulder, hit the flashers, and grabbed his heavy maglite. He walked to the edge of the cliff and shined the beam down into the ravine. 60 feet down, resting upside down in the tangled pines and the mud, was an old, beaten-up Ford pickup. Smoke was still hissing from the radiator. Elias scrambled down that steep, treacherous embankment in the freezing rain. When he got to the truck, he found the driver. He was an older man, maybe in his 60s. I won't give you the heavy details, but Elias, with his medic training from the army, knew the second he checked the man's pulse that he was already gone. The impact had been too much. Elias climbed back up to the road, got on his CB radio, and called it in to the highway patrol. He waited there for an hour until the troopers and the wrecker arrived. He gave his statement, drank a cup of awful coffee from a trooper's thermos, and prepared to get back in his rig. But just before he climbed into his cab, Elias looked down at his boots. There, stuck to the wet toe of his work boot, was an envelope. It must have been thrown from the cab of the Ford pickup when it rolled, blowing up the embankment in the wind, only to be stepped on by Elias in the dark. Elias peeled it off his boot. It was sealed. It had a stamp on it. But the wet mud and the pooling oil from the wreck had soaked into the paper. The return address was completely obliterated. The street address for the destination was nothing but a black smear. But through the mud, in a shaky, old man's handwriting, you could just make out the name and the city. To Sarah, Roanoke, Virginia. Now, the law and the protocol are very clear here. That letter was property found at the scene of a fatal accident. It belonged to the state police, or it belonged in a dead letter office. But Elias looked at the letter, and he looked down into the ravine, where the coroner was covering the body of an old man who had died alone in the rain. He was trying to get this to the post office, Elias thought. He was on his way to mail this. Elias didn't give the letter to the troopers. He folded it in half, slipped it into the breast pocket of his jacket, climbed into his truck, and put the rig in gear. And for the next 7 years, Elias carried that letter. He didn't just carry it. He hunted for the woman it belonged to. Every time Elias had a layover in Roanoke, he didn't sleep at the motel. He went to the local library. He pulled the municipal directories. He opened the phone books. Do you know how many women named Sarah lived in the greater Roanoke area in the 1990s? Thousands. But Elias had a system. He knew the old man in the wreck had been from northern Georgia, based on the license plate the troopers had read over the radio. So Elias looked for Sarahs who had moved to Virginia from Georgia. He looked for marriage records, property deeds. He spent his own money on private records requests. He spent his vacation weeks driving his personal car around Roanoke neighborhoods, knocking on doors, asking bewildered women named Sarah if they had a father who drove an old blue Ford pickup. His dispatcher told him he was crazy. His friends told him to let it go. It was a piece of paper. It was probably a birthday card or a gas bill. But Elias remembered the old man's handwriting, the shaky, desperate pressure of the pen. Elias knew, the way Hollis Bream knew about the trucks, that this letter was heavy. It was a stone that needed to be set down in the right place. It took him 7 years and 3 months. In the winter of 1999, Elias found a property tax record for a woman named Sarah who had finalized a divorce and reverted to her maiden name, a name that matched a vague property record from the county in Georgia where the old man had died. On a Tuesday afternoon, before his night shift began, Elias drove his own car to a small, single-story house on the outskirts of Roanoke. He knocked on the door. A woman in her late 30s answered. She looked tired. She had a toddler on her hip. "Can I help you?" she asked. Elias took his hat off. "Are you Sarah? Did you used to live in Raban County, Georgia?" The woman frowned, shifting the child on her hip. "Yes, a long time ago. Who are you?" Elias reached into his heavy jacket. He pulled out a small, zip-top plastic bag. Inside it was a mud-stained, oil-soaked, 7-year-old envelope. "Ma'am," Elias said, his voice incredibly gentle. "My name is Elias. I drive the mail. 7 years ago, I was the first one on the scene of a bad wreck on the Devil's Elbow. I found this in the wreckage. I believe your father was trying to put this in a mailbox when he went off the road. It took me a long time to find you. I'm sorry it's late." Sarah stared at the plastic bag. All the color drained out of her face. Her hand was trembling so hard when she reached for it that Elias had to help her hold it. She asked Elias to come inside. She sat him down at her kitchen table, and with shaking hands, she opened the envelope that had been sealed for 7 years. There was a single piece of lined notebook paper inside. Sarah read it, and then she put her face in her hands, and she let out a sound that Elias later said he would never forget, as long as he lived. A sound of a dam breaking after 10 years of pressure. When she finally caught her breath, she looked at Elias, her face streaked with tears, and she told him the story. She and her father had a terrible falling out when she was 25. Words were said that couldn't be unsaid. She had moved away, changed her number, and cut him out of her life completely. For years, she carried a hard, bitter anger. But eventually, the anger had turned into a hollow ache. When she heard he had died in a car accident in 1992, it broke her. Because he had never reached out. He had died without ever trying to make it right. She thought he had simply stopped loving her. She had carried that belief that she was unloved and forgotten every single day for 7 years. She slid the mud-stained piece of notebook paper across the table to Elias. Elias looked at it. In that shaky, old man scrawl, there were only 4 sentences. "Sarah, I am too old and too stubborn, but I am so tired of this quiet house. I know I have no right to ask, but I am going to pack a bag and drive up to Virginia on Tuesday. I am coming to beg you to forgive me." He hadn't forgotten her. He hadn't stopped loving her. He had packed his bags, gotten in his truck, and driven into a terrible mountain storm, solely to bring his daughter back. He died trying to get to her. And for 7 years, the only proof of that love was sitting in the breast pocket of a stranger driving a mail truck in the dark. Sarah kept Elias at that table for 2 hours. She made him coffee. She introduced him to her son. She told him that he hadn't just brought her a letter. He had given her her father back. He had rewritten the ending of her life. Elias finished his coffee, tipped his hat, and walked back out to his car. He drove to the sorting facility, hooked his rig up to a 53-foot trailer full of canvas bins, and drove out into the night. He did that route for another 10 years, and he never looked at a piece of mail the same way again. So, here is the very last thing I want you to carry tonight. We spend so much time on these roads thinking about the miles between us and where we're going. We think about the separation, the distance. But you have to remember that a road is not a barrier. A road is a bridge. It is a ribbon of asphalt poured across the earth specifically so we can reach each other. The highway takes people. Yes. The highway hides things. Yes. But it is also the only way we find our way back. It is the way a town tends a stranger's grave. It is the way a sister's DNA finally reaches across 40 years. It is the way an old man's notebook brings a ghost into the light. It is the way a trucker shields a terrified kid in the desert. It is the way an old man in a Ford pickup tries, one last time, to get to his little girl. The road connects us, and out here, in the dark, you are part of that connection. You are carrying something, or you are going to someone, or you are just keeping the blood pumping through the country while it sleeps. Look out your windshield. Do you see it? The sky isn't black anymore. It's turning a deep, bruised blue. The tree lines are starting to show their edges. In your rearview mirror, the lights of the highway are starting to look a little less sharp, a little more tired. The sun is coming up. The night is over. The monsters are gone. The ghosts have gone back to sleep. You survived the dark, and you made the miles, and the world is about to wake up and take the wheel from you. If you made it this far with me, thank you. Thank you for your company. Thank you for letting me ride shotgun in the quiet hours. Keep your eyes on the road. keep your heart open to the strangers you pass. And wherever it is you're headed today, get there safe. Good morning and goodbye. The thing about the sun going down is that it never asks if you're ready. You can watch it sink in the rear view, pulling those long, bruised shadows across the pavement, and you can tell yourself you have plenty of daylight left. But you don't. The horizon swallows it whole. The sky turns the color of old iron, and suddenly you are back in it, the empire of the night. Welcome back to the passenger seat. I told you I'd be here. Pull the belt across. Settle in. Turn the heater up a notch, because the air out here gets thin and bitter once the warmth of the sun bleeds out of the asphalt. We've got a whole new stretch of road ahead of us tonight, and a whole new set of ghosts waiting out there beyond the throw of the headlights. If you drive these highways long enough, you start to notice the things the world left behind. The places that used to be the center of somebody's universe, until they poured a new interstate 10 miles north and drained all the life out of them. The empty gas stations with the pumps ripped out, the diners with boarded-up windows, the fading billboards for attractions that haven't been open since 1985. Most people look at those ruins and see nothing but decay. But a place doesn't just stop existing because people stopped looking at it. There are still people out there in the bypass towns, holding on. Our first story tonight is about one of them, a woman who refused to turn off the lights when everybody else went dark. And the one night, years after the world forgot about her, that her light was the only thing that mattered. Let me tell you about the neon anchor. Route 66 is a ghost of what it used to be. But in the middle stretches of New Mexico, there are still pieces of it clinging to the scrubland. Before Interstate 40 came through and drew a straight, fast line across the map, these little two-lane towns were the only way west. They thrived on the traffic. They built motor courts and diners and massive, glorious neon signs to flag down the tired families driving through the desert night. Martha owned one of those motor courts, the Starlight Motel. She and her husband had bought it in the early 70s, back when the parking lot was full every night. It was a humble place, 12 single-story rooms arranged in a crescent shape, doors painted a bright turquoise. But its pride and joy was the sign. A 40-foot steel pylon right by the roadside, topped with a massive, pulsing, multicolored neon star that you could see from 3 miles away in either direction. Then came the interstate. It bypassed Martha's town by 12 miles. 12 miles in the desert might as well be the moon. Within 5 years, the gas station closed. The diner closed. The other 3 motels folded. The town dried up and blew away in the alkali dust. Martha's husband passed away in the late 80s, leaving her alone in a 12-room motel that was lucky to see 3 customers a month, just a few lost tourists, or stubborn traditionalists driving the old route. She was bleeding money. The property taxes, the upkeep, and most of all, the electric bill. That 40-foot neon star took an ungodly amount of power. The few friends Martha had left in town begged her to turn it off. They told her it was a waste. They told her she was burning her pension just to advertise to the coyotes and the tumbleweeds. But Martha wouldn't do it. She said, "The dark out here is too deep to just turn off the last light." She said that when you turn off the sign, you're admitting that you're dead. And Martha wasn't dead yet. So, every night at dusk, she walked into the little front office, flipped the heavy breaker switch, and listened to the massive transformer hum to life. The giant star would buzz, flicker, and flare into brilliant pink and white fire, casting long, neon shadows across an empty highway. She did this for 15 years, a stubborn old woman illuminating a graveyard, until a Tuesday night in the late summer of 1997. It was a bad night out in the basin. Late August, monsoons had rolled in the kind of sudden, violent desert storms that dump a month's worth of rain in an hour. The arroyos were flooding, turning dry dirt channels into raging rivers of mud. The sky was pitch black, thick with low-hanging clouds, and the lightning was striking so close you could taste the ozone through the window glass. Martha was sitting in the front office, doing a crossword puzzle, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof. The neon star outside was buzzing loudly, its pink light reflecting off the wet pavement of the empty road. At 2 a.m., the front door of the office rattled. Martha looked up. Standing on the welcome mat, soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and covered in thick red mud from the waist down, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 9 years old. He didn't have shoes on, his t-shirt was torn, and his eyes were wide, glassy circles of absolute shock. Martha didn't ask questions. You don't ask questions when a barefoot child walks out of a desert monsoon at 2 in the morning. She rushed around the counter, grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the back room, wrapped it around him, and sat him by the space heater. She locked the front door, pulled the blinds, and dialed 911. Because Martha knew, even before the sheriff's deputies arrived, that a child doesn't just wander onto an abandoned highway. When the deputies got there, they recognized the boy immediately. Every cop in the state had his picture taped to their dashboard. His name was Leo. He had been abducted from a rest stop on Interstate 40, 50 miles away, 10 hours earlier. The man who took him had panicked when he heard the Amber Alert go out over the radio. Knowing the state troopers would be setting up roadblocks on the interstate, the kidnapper had turned off I-40, trying to navigate the web of old, unpaved ranch roads and forgotten highways to slip through the net. But a man who doesn't respect the desert will get eaten by it. When the monsoon hit, the kidnapper tried to cross a low water crossing. The flash flood caught the heavy sedan, sweeping it off the dirt road and wedging it deep into a rocky ravine. The water was rising. The kidnapper, terrified of drowning, kicked his way out of the window. He told Leo he was going to find help. But he didn't unbind the boy's hands. He left him in the back seat of a car that was rapidly filling with muddy water and disappeared into the storm. Leo was 9, but he was smart. When the water reached the seat cushions, he managed to worm his bound hands down his legs, slip off his own sneakers, and use the friction of the wet seatbelt to loosen the zip tie on his wrists, just enough to break it. He climbed out the shattered window and scrambled up the muddy bank of the ravine, just minutes before the car was completely submerged. He was free. But he was entirely alone, in the middle of hundreds of square miles of trackless New Mexico scrubland, in the dead of night, in a raging thunderstorm. If you are a child out there in that dark, you have no reference points. There are no streetlights. The clouds covered the stars. You can't see the mountains. If you pick the wrong direction, you will walk into the deep desert, and you will not survive the night. Leo stood on the edge of the ravine, shivering, surrounded by nothing but blackness and the roar of the rain. He spun around, trying to figure out which way the car had been driving, but he was completely disoriented. And then he looked east. Miles away, cutting through the heavy, rain-soaked clouds, he saw a faint, pulsing glow. A smudge of brilliant pink in a world of absolute black. It wasn't much, just a colored reflection on the low belly of the storm clouds. But it was light, and light meant people. Leo fixed his eyes on that pink smudge, and he started walking. He walked through briars that tore his clothes. He walked through mud that sucked at his bare feet. He walked for nearly 4 miles, navigating strictly by the rhythm of that pulsing glow on the horizon, until he stumbled out of the brush, stepped onto the wet asphalt of old Route 66, and looked up at a 40-foot neon star, buzzing defiantly against the storm. The deputies found the kidnapper the next morning. He had gotten hopelessly turned around in the dark and had walked in a circle until he collapsed from exposure. He survived, only to face the inside of a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. When the news crew showed up at the Starlight Motel the following day, they asked Martha how she felt about being a hero. Martha, who had no patience for television cameras, stood on the porch of her crumbling motel, looked at the reporter, and pointed up at the massive steel sign. "I'm not a hero," she said. "I'm just a woman who kept the porch light on. That boy is the hero. He walked through hell. All I did was give him something to walk toward." The story of the Starlight Motel made the national broadcasts, and something strange happened after that. The people who remembered the old roads, the truckers, the road trippers, the people who loved the history of the highway, they started taking the 12-mile detour off the interstate. Martha's parking lot didn't fill up entirely, but she never had an empty night again. People drove out of their way just to sleep in one of those 12 turquoise rooms, and to buy a cup of coffee from the stubborn old woman who refused to let the dark win. Martha passed away in 2004, but before she died, the local historical society bought the property. They didn't have the funds to keep the motel running, but they set up a trust for one specific purpose. If you drive that desolate stretch of old Route 66 today, the rooms are boarded up, the parking lot is overgrown with weeds, but at dusk, a timer clicks in the front office. The heavy breaker throws, and a 40-foot neon star flares to life. burning brilliant pink and white against the desert night. They leave it on, because you never know who is out there in the dark, lost in the storm, looking for a reason to keep walking. That was the neon anchor. Take a breath. Watch the dotted lines blur past the hood. The road is full of signals, if you know how to look for them. Neon signs. Mile markers. The reflectors glowing in the dirt. We leave these things behind to talk to the people coming after us, to say, "I was here. This is the way." But sometimes, the signals we leave behind don't make sense. Sometimes, they ring out into the void long after we're gone, and they wait for someone to answer. This next story is about one of those signals. It's about a man whose job was to dismantle the past, and the night the past called him back. Let me tell you about the last payphone. If you are under a certain age, you probably don't even notice the empty metal pedestals at gas stations and rest stops anymore, the rusted silver husks where the payphones used to be. But for decades, those armored blue and silver boxes were lifelines. They were how you called a tow truck when your engine blew. They were how you called your wife to say you'd be home late. They were the confessionals of the highway. By the early 2010s, they were practically extinct. Cell phones had killed them. The major telecom companies were losing millions of dollars a year, maintaining thousands of payphones that hadn't seen a quarter drop in a decade. So, they sent men out to kill them. Arthur was one of those men. He was a line technician for a regional telecom out in West Texas. A quiet, methodical guy who spent his days driving a white utility truck with an orange light bar, driving hundreds of miles between nowhere and nothing, just to unbolt a receiver, snip the copper wire, and bolt a blank metal plate over the face of the machine. He didn't hate the work, but he found it profoundly sad. Arthur was a nostalgic guy. He knew that every time his heavy wire cutters snapped through that copper line, he was permanently severing a connection to the world. He was making the road just a little bit quieter, a little bit lonelier. It was a Thursday in November. Arthur was on the extreme outer edge of his service territory, driving a cracked two-lane blacktop that ran parallel to the Mexican border. It was a desolate landscape, nothing but pump jacks nodding in the dust, wire fences, and sky. His work ticket for the day had one final stop, a decommissioned rest area 50 miles from the nearest town. The state had closed the rest area years ago, boarding up the cinder block bathrooms and letting the asphalt return to the weeds. But out by the entrance ramp, under a rusted metal canopy, stood a single, weathered payphone. According to the telecom logs, this specific phone hadn't placed an outgoing call in 6 years. It was a ghost. Arthur pulled his utility truck up to the canopy. The sun had just gone down, plunging the scrubland into that deep, violet twilight that makes everything look like a photograph from the 1970s. He unlatched his tool belt, grabbed his heavy snips, and walked over to the booth. It was covered in years of graffiti and wind-blown dirt. The receiver hung in its cradle, dead to the world. Arthur reached into the casing, preparing to make the final cut, and the phone rang. It wasn't a digital chirp. It was the loud, violent, mechanical bra-ing of an old brass bell inside the armored casing. Arthur froze. He actually pulled his hands back like the machine had bitten him. Payphones don't just ring, especially not out here. Nobody had the number to this specific booth, except the telecom company's internal testing switchboard, and they wouldn't be testing a line scheduled for termination. Bruh! Ing! The sound echoed off the empty cinder block bathrooms. It sounded impossibly loud in the dead quiet of the desert. Arthur stared at the heavy metal handset. His brain cycled through logical explanations. A misdialed telemarketer, a routing error in the local switch, a prank, bruh, ing. The hair on the back of Arthur's neck stood up. It went against every instinct in his body to answer it. He was there to kill the machine, not to talk to it. But you stand in the desert twilight and listen to a dead bell ring, and you tell me what you do. Arthur reached out, picked up the heavy plastic receiver, and put it to his ear. "Hello?" he said. His voice sounded thin and small. For a second, there was nothing, just the heavy, ocean sound of static on a decaying copper line. Then, a voice. "Is someone there?" It was a woman's voice. She sounded breathless, terrified, and very far away. "Yes, I'm here," Arthur said, gripping the receiver tighter. "This is Arthur with the telecom company. Who is this? Are you looking for someone?" My name is Diane," the woman gasped. I don't know who I called. I just dialed the operator. Please, you have to help me. I can't get out. Arthur felt his stomach drop. Diane, where are you? Are you trapped? I was driving, she said, her voice shaking violently. A truck crossed the center line. I swerved. I went off the road. I'm in my car, but it's sideways. I can't open the door. It smells like gas. Please, it smells so strongly of gas. Arthur turned and looked around the empty rest stop. The highway in both directions was completely barren. Diane, listen to me. I'm going to call 911 on my cell phone right now. But you have to tell me where you are. What highway are you on? I don't know, she cried. It's so dark. I left Midland 2 hours ago. I was headed south. There was a sign for a canyon. Arthur's mind raced. He was 2 hours south of Midland. He was right near the canyon turnoffs. Diane, stay on the line. Do not hang up. Arthur reached for his cell phone on his belt. But as he pulled it up, he saw the screen. No service. He was 50 miles from a cell tower. Diane, I don't have a signal out here, Arthur said, his heart hammering. I'm going to use my truck radio to call the dispatcher, and they'll get the state troopers. Just tell me everything you can see. Nothing, she sobbed. Just the weeds. And there's a big wire. A cable. I hit a wooden pole when I went off. It snapped. The wires are all over the hood of my car. Arthur stopped breathing. He looked up. Running parallel to the highway, stretching out into the twilight, was the old wooden telephone pole line that carried the copper wire for the payphone he was holding. He turned and looked down the highway, squinting into the gathering dark. About half a mile north of the rest stop, the line of wooden poles seemed to sag. The wires are all over the hood of my car. Diane, Arthur whispered, how did you make this call? I have a car phone, she said, her voice growing fainter. An old bag phone. It's the only thing that had a dial tone. But the screen is cracked. I just hit 0. Arthur understood, in a flash of terrifying clarity, exactly what had happened. Diane hadn't dialed a payphone. She had gone off the road and sheared a telephone pole. When her car snapped the pole, the massive bundle of copper lines running underground and overhead had ripped. Her old analog car phone, desperately searching for a connection, had bridged physically with the exposed copper wire resting on the metal frame of her car. It had completed a circuit. She hadn't dialed the payphone. The short circuit had sent a massive voltage spike down the only unbroken line, left the line terminating at the rest stop half a mile away. The spike triggered the brass ringer in the booth. Arthur was talking to her through the wreckage of her own accident. Diane, Arthur yelled into the receiver. I know where you are. I'm coming right now. Do not move. Arthur dropped the receiver. It dangled by its armored cord, swinging in the wind. He sprinted to his utility truck, threw it into gear, and slammed his foot on the gas. He tore out of the rest area, hauling down the wrong side of the highway, eyes locked on the telephone poles. Half a mile up, just as she had said, a pole was snapped cleanly at the base. It was leaning heavily, supported only by the tension of the remaining wires. Arthur slammed on the brakes, grabbed his massive maglite and his fire extinguisher, and bailed out of the truck. He ran to the edge of the shoulder and shined his beam down into the dark. The shoulder dropped off sharply into a deep, dry culvert, hidden entirely by thick mesquite bushes. You could drive past it 1,000 times and never know it was there. Resting at the bottom of the culvert, flipped onto its side and tangled in heavy black telecommunication cables, was a silver sedan. Gasoline was pooling on the hot exhaust pipe. It was hissing, sending up thick, white smoke. Arthur slid down the embankment, ripping his hands on the mesquite thorns. He reached the car and shined his light into the shattered windshield. Diane was suspended by her seatbelt, bleeding from a cut on her forehead, but conscious. When she saw the beam of Arthur's flashlight, she started to cry. Arthur used his heavy lineman snips to smash the rest of the windshield glass out. He reached in, cut her seatbelt, and pulled her through the broken glass, dragging her up the embankment just as the pooling gasoline caught a spark from the severed wires. They were 30 yards away, lying panting in the dirt by the side of the highway, when the sedan went up in a ball of orange fire. Arthur sat up, dialed his truck radio, and called the emergency in to his dispatcher. Then he sat in the dirt next to Diane, wrapped his uniform jacket around her shivering shoulders, and waited for the sirens. A few weeks later, After Diane had recovered and Arthur had gone back to his roots, Arthur's supervisor called him into the main office in Midland. The supervisor slid a printed log across the desk. It was the switchboard data from that Thursday night. The supervisor looked at Arthur, completely baffled. "Artie, you reported that you pulled a woman out of a wreck on Highway 385 because you got a call at the decommissioned rest stop." "That's right," Arthur said. "Her car bridged the severed line. It caused the payphone to ring. It was 1,000,000 to 1 short circuit." The supervisor tapped the paper. "Arthur, that payphone line was dead. Not just inactive, dead. We cut the trunk line supplying that entire sector at the main switch in town 3 hours before you even got to the rest stop. There was no voltage. There was no connection. That phone was a hollow metal box. It was physically impossible for it to ring." Arthur looked at the log. He looked at his supervisor. Then he thought about the heavy brass bra-ing echoing off the cinder block walls in the desert twilight. He thought about the sound of a woman's voice asking for help over a deadline. Arthur didn't argue. He just nodded, handed the paper back, and walked out of the office. He never told anyone that the phone had rung on a dead line. He didn't care about the physics of it. He cared that he had been there to answer it. Arthur retired a few years later. But before he handed over the keys to his utility truck, he went back out to that rest stop. He didn't have a work order. He walked up to the rusted blue and silver payphone. He didn't use his wire cutters. He used a rag and some cleaner. He wiped the dirt off the instruction placard. He polished the heavy metal buttons. And he left it exactly as he found it. Because out here, on the long roads, you just never know. Sometimes, the universe needs a conduit. Sometimes, an emergency is so loud, so desperate, that it travels through the air, down the dead copper, and rings a bell just to see if anyone is listening. You just have to be willing to pick up the receiver. That was the last payphone. Keep your hands on the wheel. The night is deep, and the miles are long, but we're making good time. I want you to think about those two stories as we roll on. The neon sign burning for nobody, and the dead phone ringing in the desert. They are two sides of the same coin, aren't they? They are about the things we build to reach each other. We are a species terrified of the dark, and terrified of being alone in it. So we pour rivers of concrete to connect our cities. We string thousands of miles of wire to carry our voices. We build neon stars to flag down the strangers passing in the night. And even when the technology moves on, even when the highway bypasses the town and the cell towers render the copper wire obsolete, the intent remains. The ghosts in the machine are just our own desperate desire to be found. So when you're driving tonight, look at the infrastructure around you. Look at the high-tension power lines marching over the hills like metal giants. Look at the green reflective signs counting down the miles to a town you've never heard of. Look at the taillights of the semi-truck 3 miles ahead of you. It's all one big, nervous system, and you are a pulse of electricity traveling down the wire. Stay alert. The hour of the wolf isn't over yet, and the road has a way of testing you when you think you've figured it out. If you want to pull over, grab a coffee from a thermos, stretch your legs, do it. But don't turn off the radio. I'm right here. We've got more miles to make, and the stories aren't done. Stay with me.